The next panelist I would like to welcome on stage is Arun Bhaulkar. He is a chief scientist and head of software engineering research at TCS Pune and has been working in the area of software modeling, testing, reverse engineering. He has earned his BTech and MTech from IIT Chennai. Please come on stage, sir. And the moderator for the panel is Ajay Deshpande. So Ajay, please come on stage and get the panel going.
Okay, folks, we are back into session, and fortunately, this time it's not only me that will be talking. So hopefully, I'll not talk much. Okay, Rusi, thanks for coming, and Arun, thanks to you as well. Let me just play a couple of ground rules on what we will be doing here, so that the idea is that I would want the audience to get as much as possible from this discussion. So the panel discussion is on programming languages. So we wanted to talk about history, first of all, and then how they have evolved over time, and probably talk a little bit about what we can see into the future, about programming languages in general. And as I can see here, we have a whole bunch of people who have been programming for some time at least. So you can appreciate what's going on out here. That said, what I was thinking was that we can give you so much, in terms of what we can talk about, but you can get a lot more than that by asking questions. So yes, there are mics here. We'll pass the mics around if people want to ask questions. And feel free to jump in. Just raise your hand, and I will slot your question into the discussion.
So I just like to add that panelists can't answer all the questions, and we hope that many of you will also add to what we have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Arun. Okay, so let me start with a few. I would like to get Rusi and Arun to talk a little bit about how they have been dabbling about in programming languages. So, Rusi, if you want to give us a background about yourself, how you have been getting into programming languages.
I was a student in 1980s with Professor Sasrabuddhe, and one of the most amazing courses which I went through at that time, 1984, I think, was a course on something called Lisp. I don't know if some people here even know what that means. I think most people think that it's talking like that, but Lisp was a language at that time. And so he taught me Lisp in 84, and then in 86 I did a project with him and implementing it. And he used to be the one teaching the basic introductory programming course at that time, which was done in Pascal, and there was really no question in anyone's mind that anything other than Pascal could be used. And in 1988, he just had everyone thought he was crazy. He said, what do people think of switching to Scheme? Scheme was a kind of Lisp at that time to teach programming. Now, because I had played around with Lisp in my student days, I said, I think this is crazy, but it sounds like a very wonderful idea, and everyone else was too shocked to say no. And since he was the boss there, it took off. So, well, that kind of set the tone for almost much of what I did after that, because in one sense, Lisp was very academic, but in another sense, it allowed you to do real-world things much more easily than so-called system programming languages like C and so on. And then a couple of years later, there was certain attempts we had made of teaching programming and mathematics together in a way which integrated. I can't get into too much of that at this point. Then in the mid-2000s, we started our own firm, which at that time I didn't think these things would be relevant to industry, but in the last couple of years, I find Haskell has become really one of the big things nowadays, and which is falling back on what I had done for 20 years.
Thanks, Rusi. Arun, if you want to give us a quick backgrounder.
Yeah. So I spent quite a lot of my early years doing a lot of programming of various kinds. which included maybe writing small compilers or business systems and a lot of tools. So, and everything was every time in a different programming language. So what you finally felt was that, okay, it doesn't matter what the programming language is, but what seemed to matter is that what is it that you want to really do, and what are the structures that you really wanted to establish out there. And of course, there were definite limitations about any programming language, and if you could stay within those and still follow some kind of a discipline or some kind of a design principle, you could achieve a lot. But of course, not necessarily good productivity. Okay, and so maybe I want to go in some inverse sequence. What is my most recent experience with programming? And how many of you have heard about Scratch? Okay, a lot of you have heard, right? What do you think about it as a language? I mean, it is incredibly, I mean, we just looked in our center, we were just talking that, maybe we should do some research in education. And somebody mentioned, why don't you look at Scratch? And when we looked at it, I mean, we are so captivated by it. We said, no, this is exactly what we want people to learn. Yeah, and it is designed as something for children. But if you go deep into it, you realize that it is far beyond that. It's much, much beyond that. And in fact, many of the institutions, including MIT, I think, teach Scratch as a first programming language in their undergraduate courses for people who are being introduced to programming. So it is that kind of a language, and so maybe for those of you who haven't been exposed to it, I'd like to say something that it is intended to be learned very easily. So you can do so many things without even knowing what is a variable. I mean, you cannot think of any programming language where you can start talking about the language without talking about the notion of a variable. So it is that kind of a thing, right? So okay, so let me just stop talking about Scratch now. And so that is the kind of thing. Or sometimes, you sit and try to develop some algorithms. And then you realize, oh, one of the best ways to maybe go and use Prolog. Okay. So, or our group tends to believe, basically that the world is around programming languages, or today you might call them modeling languages, or you may call them something else. But finally, computing is about this. The central thing is programming. And it is sometimes very strange to find that there are many computer science courses which don't teach you programming language. I mean, they teach you a programming language, but they don't try. Let's say they don't teach you compiling. Compilers has become an optional course. So sometimes it's very strange that we don't have a course which is focused on design of programming languages, because that is really what I believe is central to computing. So that's the kind of background which I come from.
Yeah, thanks, Rosie. Thanks, Arun. So it's interesting that my first question was around the area that Arun was referring to. You all might have this experience that when a new project starts in Persistent, for example, we say, oh, should we do this in Java, or is this a .NET? So that is like the highest level of programming language selection, so to speak, at this thing. So I wanted to ask the panelists, is this a programming language selection problem, or is this a paradigm selection problem? How do we start? Should we select the paradigm first? Because you talked about functional, Lucy. So can you throw some light on what do you do? Do you select the paradigm first or the programming language first?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, your example is really extreme, that do you choose C# or do you choose Java, and then you have a major from the top guys in the organization having a bike shedding argument about that. And typically the guys at all levels, it happens not just in a corporate sector, it happens in academics also. they don't know what's a declarative idea, or they don't know what scripting means. And sometimes a scripting solution may give in a few dozen lines what a C programmer will do in hundreds of lines and write a. I mean, I have seen, for example, in the university, the same project will be done by one guy in C, and he'll make an MSc project out of it or an MTech project out of it, and the other guy would do it in a weekend with some scripting language. Okay, but the the reverse side of this is that when you go above the level of technology, that means when you stop asking, is it Java or C Sharp, and you start asking the questions of paradigms, then basically we don't have a language to talk about these things. So, for example, the classical description which happened in a programming languages course will be OOP versus FP versus imperative and so on. And in that framework, things like scripting or async, these things don't fit. So we don't have a broad spectrum to talk of what are all the choices, you know. That is a real problem.
So what according to you are the, let's do a laundry list of possibilities. That'll help, I think. So you mentioned declarative.
I'll start rather from what Arun just now said. You use a language like Scratch, you can teach people to program significant things without even talking of a variable. I think this is a little extreme, but I think it's more or less on the line. Okay. Now, what this implies is that if you look inside the head of a Scratch programmer, and if you look inside the head of a C++ programmer, the circuitry has no relation. They are thinking completely different thoughts. So what that means is, to me at least, maybe I'm speaking with a somewhat academic bias, that technology questions are really mostly less relevant than paradigm questions. And paradigm, you can use other words for it. You can call it perspective. I like to call it philosophy, because it's a way of thinking. It's a groove along which you approach things. It's not just your programming habit, it's many other things. And if all the thoughts are in the line of the technology which we choose, we are probably limiting the search space to a small neighborhood of the same thing, like Java versus C Sharp.
So, okay, there are sort of multiple perspectives here. So, one is, okay, if you're doing a commercial project, you may not have any choice at all, you know. So, whether to use Java or C Sharp may be a complete academic discussion, and somebody will force something on you. But leaving that aside, you know, if you're doing something which is going to be for a long time, let's say you're building your own product, you know, which is going to have a long life, then maybe you want to ask a lot of questions about not which programming language, you know, but it is like, how would you think about this product that you're building, right? What would be a good language or a specification or a model which will express the key things that you want to sort of design into your thing? How do you want to think about that problem? You know, and that is what I feel is the key to these things. Finally, you know, what you want to do is treat your Java environment or your whatever Python environment, you know, whatever you want to call it, treat that as a platform, okay? In the sense that that's your execution platform. So if you take a language like C or something, then your execution platform is typically your operating system, right? I mean, you're kind of programming at that level. But if you are solving a business problem or a more complicated system problem, then I think your focus should be on how do I think about that problem? And then what is the language that I can really use, that I can actually create? That I think is the fundamental thing. And so sometimes, so that's why I think he said, you know, Haskell that's one of the reasons why things like that are catching on, because people are talking more and more about domain-specific languages. Can I devise a domain-specific language which can capture what it is that I want to express, and then maybe embed that into a more sort of platform-oriented language. So maybe I can generate Java code from it, or C++ code from it, or whatever it is that is meaningful. So that is the way I would encourage people to ask the question.
So, Arun, what exactly is a domain-specific language? How do you define a domain-specific language?
Oh, okay. So that really depends on your point of view. So I could even say that COBOL is a domain-specific language because it deals extremely. If you compare COBOL to C, and then you take the typical kind of business functions that people do, it's much more easily expressible. It's rich, right? I mean, you can express a lot of, like for example, decimal arithmetic. You can do it very easily in COBOL, okay? And but you would it look a very horrible program in C. Plus, you will get a lot of errors as well, okay, in doing arithmetic. So you can see that now if you take the domain of currency or whatever, dealing with currencies, right? Then you got that right. So that's a very low level domain. But then you can take it to say, let's say my domain is defining a telecom product. So telecom companies keep coming out with new products all the time, right? And then can I just have a way of expressing and defining what exactly that product is, what it means to customers, what it means to implement on an underlying infrastructure that exists. So a language in which you can express that is something. So even as if you take awk, for example, right? I mean, that's a domain-specific language. It helps you to do some string matching very easily, right? So that's the kind of things that we are talking about. So the language is also this. It's the vocabulary, it is the structure, it is the semantics. So all of those things that come.
Yeah, thanks. Rusi, you wanted to add something?
I see that there is a certain chicken and egg problem here, because you see this domain-specific language is related to what is nowadays a fashionable thing called domain-driven design, right? So we have a domain, and we want to evolve the language for talking about that domain. Now, domain-driven design tends to be at a higher level than the DSLs, but it's still the same kind of thing. Now, the chicken and egg problem here is that to talk about that domain in the design sense or in the language sense, we need a language to proceed, right? So now, invariably, if we are not a little conscious about it, what happens is that the baseline language over which we talk, people will say it's not a language, it's just into quotes, pseudocode, right? Now, just pseudocode is almost invariably a synonym for imperative programming with bad syntax. Okay, so we don't really know what it means to have just pseudocode with a paradigm slot in the in a parameter. We can't say just functional pseudocode or just logic pseudocode, And that's a kind of chicken and egg problem, don't you think? That?
Yeah, I completely agree. So it's not that domain-specific languages are widely used today, or people can develop them, and so that's more a trend that is happening, and a lot more research definitely needs.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to add there is that there are like tons of domains, right? What we will wind up doing is coming up with many languages for each domain, so to speak. Where do we stop? So there has to be some kind of quote unquote generic languages, right?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the generic languages and the multiple paradigms have their place. So it's not like there is one language which is enough to completely solve your problem, because your final solution is not going to be based only on that high level specification. Finally, there is the underlying platform, and you're programming at many different levels. So so how do you specify each of those things orthogonally, so to say, So for example, I have to access the database. So how do I do database access? So I have a language which is very suitable for doing database access. And then I have a language which is very suitable for handling messages, for example, right? Or another language which is very suitable for handling user interfaces. So I have to mix all of these together in some sensible way. So it is how you glue all these things together also is a big problem. Right? So it's not that there is a magic
Okay, yeah,
solution
got
to
you.
things.
So actually, what I think we are coming out with is that there are multiple languages, and when we execute a project, maybe we should look at a project as a mixture of multiple languages. I mean, everything need not be solved only in Java, for example.
So it's finally about separation of concerns. You know, you can say all software engineering research is about how do I understand my problem. I mean, and understand each one of my concerns independently on one hand, but I still know how to synthesize all of these things into a complete solution.
Yeah.
So that remains the basic problem, and then you keep improving on how you approach these things.
Sure. Thanks. Lucy, you wanted to add anything to that?
Yeah, it's just that just, I think, rephrasing what Arun said, that when we decompose and resynthesize, the question then comes down to the quality of our glue. And it appears after 40, 50 years of programming language research that our standard programming languages provide very poor quality glue. It's like I need araldite, but I only have atta. You know, I mean, atta can also be used as glue, but it's not very high quality glue. Yeah. And so these toy languages, I'm using the word toy into quote, like Python and awk, they end up giving so much better glue than so-called system languages that now there is a total swing in the reverse direction, and people think everything can be done with Python. And now that has its own kind of consequences. I mean, we can get into that. I don't want to. I'm just saying that in a somewhat more abstract sense, glue is a very central problem. To human beings, as the extra said, have finite heads with finite capacities. And when we are trying to solve fairly significant problems, the only way we have is what you call separation of concerns. So we have to be able to break up the problem and then to people put it together into a solution. Now, breaking up, fine, we do it in some arbitrary way, but when you put it together, the glue is substandard, then we get mess. Okay, so when we are actually today, after so many years of Liskov and such people, now I think some of the biggest open questions which we are dealing with is what are the good and what are the bad signs of glue?
Interesting. Very interesting. I have another dimension to throw in this thing. There is this weak typed and strongly typed whatever religious wars, so to speak. So just to this thing, weak typed are, there is no type at all, like in JavaScript, for example, and whatever it points to, you figure out what it is at runtime. So I wanted to ask you both, have you, participated in these wars any time? And what are your views on this typing? Is it so critical that we need to be worried about it? So Arun,
yeah. So that would really depend on how critical it is, that to run into a type error at runtime. So, for example, if you go to the automotive embedded systems world, okay, they are extremely sensitive to these things. Though, of course, they use only C programming, right? And they don't do that. But still, then they will have all kinds of rules, right? Which standards would say that, okay, you cannot use pointers in this way, you can use them only in this way, right? So all of those restrictions come in, and where it is very critical that you don't run into such an error at an unexpected time. Or alternatively, you have tools which can do static analysis and tell you, look, under these conditions, you can run into this problem. Okay. I mean, so that is the other end. So you're actually like one of my colleagues keep reminding me, that life is only about trade-offs. There is no magic solution to anything. So you need to make your trade-offs very clearly here, and so so that is what this debate also represents. Whether you want something very dynamic, you can do whatever you want, and there are situations where it really helps, versus where you can't afford it. So,
Rosie, your thoughts on that?
Well, these words have very different meanings to different people. And one somewhat loose way of talking about it would be that when you used, now I'm talking a little bit in the earlier generation of languages like Prolog, Lisp, and so on, you didn't see anything like a type, and so you call them untyped languages. And then there were the system languages, what you call traditional languages, which you can't start doing anything until you talk of the types. And so in that framework, your question becomes a good question. But today, I think the question is somewhat obsolete, because you have languages like Haskell, where you don't see a single type. That means you can write a full Haskell program without any type. And yet it is more strongly typed than Java, C#, and so on, because if anything goes wrong, it is compile time detected. That's what is called Hindley-Milner type inference. So that Hindley-Milner type inference has gotten to such a level today that statically the system proves your types are correct, but the programmer just doesn't write any types. We teach our students, please write the type so that what you think is the type and what the system infers as the type match. Typically, if you don't write the type, the system will infer a most general type, which will solve many more problems than you imagine. But if you are in sync, it all works. And if you don't know what type you write, it'll just work out correct. So I'm saying in the framework of modern languages which have type inferencing rather than type declaration, this question becomes a little significantly different.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I would love to see that in JavaScript, but unfortunately, we don't have that.
Yeah, well, CoffeeScript probably has some of it.
Yeah. So actually, now that you mentioned Haskell, I just wanted to ask you, many of the people here might not know what are functional languages and the kinds of features that they can provide. So can you throw some light on that? How would you start defining?
Yeah, well, when you look at the hype about functional languages, it is usually very negative. Functional language have no assignment or something like that. Now, you can't really make a claim that something is good because something is not there, So, I mean, I don't know if I can show a line.
Sure. Yeah, why not? You can use the mic next to it.
Rethink what we know of quicksort. We have a list of elements. One element is picked out. Oh, I've forgotten one thing. I'll go back and send it. So what do we want to do? We want to partition that list into two parts. Everything less than x. So the list is basically an element x followed by something. Take everything from that something is x's, more x's, okay? So everything from the remaining x's which are less than x, put x in the middle, put everything from the remaining x's which are more than x. And what I've forgotten is that I have to make two recursive calls there. So when you first see code like this, you either believe it's just abstract description or you think, well, there's magic going on. But I can assure you, when you start using programming languages like this, you get used to magic. Magic happens by default, okay? So there are many, many things here. There is this set-like expression here. Then there is pattern matching happening on the left-hand side. There is this first-class list syntax. Okay, all these things together make for, it can be at least an order of magnitude shift in programmer productivity.
So by and large, one of the basic things about functional that we all know is that there is a huge amount of productivity increase, as we can see here. Arun, you want to add anything?
So actually, this is a surprising question. I guess all of us know SQL, right? I mean, SQL is a completely declarative language. And so about in the late sort of mid 80s, when Oracle and IBM came out with relational products, everybody had this doubt, I mean, how can this perform well? Okay. Today it is hard to imagine anyone even asking that question. Nobody thinks about it, right? There is nobody who, I mean, in fact, today people are going in a different way, but so it's really, it's about how well we can think about the problem and how we can implement a model efficiently on a given platform. I mean, these are two sort of related problems, but still problems that can be managed independently, and that's really what we need to do.
Thanks, Arun. So that actually brings us to another interesting point that I was going to talk about. And this is also coming from Barbara's times. One of the things that she had a diktat for her students was that programs and programming languages, when designed, new ones, should be better for people who are reading them than people who are writing them. So let me tell you what that means. Writing, I will always want to type as less as possible. Okay? Whereas in reading, I would like to know as much more information about the program that is being written as possible. Now, the interesting thing about this whole aspect is that functional tries to do both. As you can see here, we are trying to express something that we know. So I just wanted to come back to Rosie and say, does functional programming really give better readability? What's your thoughts on that?
This is a loaded question because when you have been initiated into the religion, then the prophet is very clear.
Okay.
But when you are still outside, then you are still choosing your prophet, you see. So people who don't grok, as the modern language go, they say, what's all this? From a business point of view, it's very straightforward. Some investment has to be made in making programmers be able to relate with this. It's not a new syntax, it's not a new technology, it's a new way of thinking. It can be programmed. I mean, I'm talking of programming this wetware here. It can be done, but it takes some investment. Okay, once that is done, programmer productivity can be expected to increase by 3 to 10-fold. But now programmers themselves are dispensable items because they change jobs. Okay, so if you make your programmers too good, they stop being your programmers. So this kind of problem is there.
Yeah. So Arun, what's your thoughts on making programming languages more reader friendly? Do you have any ideas and anything that you can share with us?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that same separation of concerns things always matters. So what makes it difficult to read a program, right? If it's trying to do 20 different things at the same time, right? If it's trying to deal with the database, it's trying to deal with the messages, it's trying to deal with the business logic. When you see all of that all mixed together, it becomes very difficult to read. So it is not because of the language, it is because of the way you have designed the whole thing, right? So it is also in the design of the whole thing that the readability can improve very differently. As well as if you use any composition techniques or generative techniques by having separate models for different things and separate strategies, then you can produce code which is nicely executable. It does what you want, but you don't have to read it. So finally, I mean, if we execute assembly code at the bottom, doesn't mean that it has to be readable. So finally, what matters is the level at which you're programming. So the readability is always going to be improved by that.
Right, thanks.
Say something in
Yeah,
this
Lucy.
respect. It's a good thing what you're saying, but now there are some factors here. You talked of mixing up business logic with presentation and all those kinds of things. Now, supposing we have never heard of something like MVC, and you mix, say, HTML with generation of HTML, database, you write your classic PHP code, okay? And then you come across some idea like MVC, which kind of makes a religion. I'm using the word religion very deliberately. You must separate model and view and controller, and if you don't do it, you are in hell. Up to some point, that sounds strange, but then a certain discipline is understood, it is practiced, and some structuring of the code arises. Now the question which comes out of that is, did not somebody have to think MVC before we go from classic unstructured PHP code into something more structured?
Yeah, I mean, definitely we discover these principles and patterns and laws, so-called laws, right, through experience. I mean, a lot of them. Maybe there are some principles which you borrow from some other field and bring them in, but I think it's very difficult without any experience of kind of, if you don't suffer through something, it is very hard to accept a new principle. so that, I think that's what the point is making it.
So actually, that is since you mentioned, it actually brings to another suffering that we are all going through. We as in programmers. So the suffering is around this new world of asynchronous, programming. So we've been taught C and we have been taught in one way of doing things. It's all sequential, but then they introduced pthreads down the line, and then they introduced threads into Java, and then now we actually have a very, very different model of programming in asynchronous, Ajax.
Like Node.js and so on.
Yeah, Node.js and even regular Ajax as well on the client side. So I just wanted to ask you, Rusi, if just from the developer's point of view, how can I reprogram myself to think in an asynchronous model?
I tell you, I was actually with Persistent on this Erlang project, and I wrote a question on the Erlang mailing list regarding the choice of using finite state automata for certain things. Now, many times the actually concurrency boils down to a lower level state change of some kind of abstract finite state automaton. So I asked this question on the Erlang list, and I was really quite new to Erlang at that point. So Joe Armstrong, as you may know, is the father of Erlang. He gave me a royal firing, and he said, if you think that async is the way to go, he didn't name Node.js, but he implied said all these things like Node.js. Then you are basically not got a clue on the world, because the world is basically concurrent. And this whole idea of Node.js, I'm talking of Node.js type or twisted in Python and so on. These models basically fudge concurrency by building a finite state automaton and then simulating the concurrency there. But it's kind of cheating, and it's putting the whole load of the programming, what you call separation of concern, that kind of load is being moved away from the machine and the operating system software onto the program. So it's a wrong direction. I mean, this is what he told me. I'm not a great expert in Erlang, but I'm just suggesting that there may be some truth in it, that going async and going concurrent are two choices, and at least from one point of view, concurrency is the right way and async is the wrong way.
Yeah, unfortunately the way browsers have been designed and the way Ajax works today, we can't live without.
Yeah, well, Ajax in the browser side we can't live without, but when people are writing full scale server side software in Node, this is a wrong direction. I cannot see there's any sense in it. The only justification is programmers are illiterate, they don't want to learn anything beyond JavaScript, so they make ridiculously complex system using the same language.
Arun, you want to add anything to that?
So I'm just going back to Scratch now. Scratch as a programming language is inherently concurrent. Okay, and you don't have to teach any kid what is concurrency. They're able to program most things. Doesn't mean that we don't know yet. Actually, I haven't experimented enough to say whether what kind of problems they will run into. But most things they're able to to deal with. So definitely the solving of those problems has to be in the analyzers, which will tell you that look here, something may go wrong here, or the engine will take care of things. So I think that has to be the way to go, because otherwise writing all these parallel programs and highly efficient programs it's humanly impossible. I mean, kind of, it's
sure.
Complexity is just too much.
Yeah. So basically, you see, your this thing is don't go asynchronous. Maybe on the browser side is okay, but
browser side is no choice.
Right.
See, JavaScript is not up for argument. It's part of the world, like global warming. You can't say I won't have JavaScript. So what JavaScript mandates, we have to do. But what JavaScript doesn't mandate, which is
you don't need
anything else, it's the wrong thing. But I just take this question a little one step beyond. There are many problems in the programming world which are essential problems, and there are many problems which are our own concocted problems. Okay, so using async inappropriately is a concocted problem. As I said, I'm assuming JavaScript in the browser is not up for argument. Okay, but using JavaScript to write a compiler for C is not a sensible thing to do.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. At this point, let me take a pause and see if the audience has any questions. Yes, please, Asim. Or I can repeat the question. Either way is fine. Just speak. It's okay. It's on.
This is a very newbie question on the Quicksort program that is written. So one primary difficulty that I face in understanding of functional programs is the underlying hardware that is going to execute this program is a sequential program computer, right? So it will execute instructions sequentially, and it will store its state in the main memory, and so on. So that model really works well for C functions that I write. But this, interpreting this is very difficult.
Let's reverse the roles. You're a C programmer?
Yes.
Okay, now I'm an assembly language programmer. Okay, so I'll ask you that for me, if you don't tell me which registers are used, I can't understand your program. How would you answer me? Because ultimately, on a von Neumann machine, nothing happens except through registers. And so if you don't tell me that AX has a different behavior from BX, AX can only be used as accumulator and BX can only be used as pointer. So you have to tell me all those things, otherwise your program is not valid, right?
Okay. So the point is to unlearn that kind of a model and...
Not unlearn, put it on the shelf. I mean that, because I can tell you what we did in Pune University for many years was to start with Haskell as the first language. And then the reverse problem happens that people write such abstract code that it either runs terribly at best or sometimes simply doesn't run at all, because this set-like expression, these are called comprehensions, they actually run sequentially.
Right.
And so it's a very interesting thing. in Haskell we have these comprehensions, in Python we have these comprehensions.
Yes.
In Python, you have reached comprehensions up from the imperative root. In Haskell, you reach down from the mathematics side. And I've seen sometimes within 4 or 5 days of each other, a question on comprehension is asked on the Python mailing list and on the Haskell mailing list. The Python mailing list, they don't have the mathematical view and they are thinking in terms of the sequencing which you are describing. Right. On the Haskell mailing list, they don't have any clue of the fact that these constructs have a cost, that they can be linear, quadratic, and so on. They write ridiculously inefficient code and say, why is it running like this? Right. So the operational view and the mathematical view are both needed. Okay. And to come back to the question which you asked, it costs. You know, in the C programming world, the mathematical view just doesn't exist. It's such a luxury that if somebody proves his program, he'll get a PhD. Okay. But in this world, you have to have both views. You have to think mathematically and you have to be able to argue operationally. I mean, obviously I'm not gone into that, but sure, both sides of it.
You've answered the question. There's a question there.
Hello, sir. I'm a Ruby programmer actually. I'm a Ruby programmer actually, and there is a event machine in Ruby, twisted in Python, and I also did a program. Means I actually built a npm package for Node.js recently. That rupees price is falling down against dollar. So I wanted a CLI application to just know what is price of rupee against dollar. So I made a command line application in npm for npm package. There is, I was actually calling to Google API for giving me the conversion, actually, real-time conversion. For that, the async problem was there. That I call to the API and I need to wait until the response comes from the Google side. So at that time, I need to write a callback function, callback code, which will be executed when the response comes from the Google side. So this is the situation. I think that async programming is needed. That our final thing will be very dependent on the response when it comes. Like we don't go like procedural way that.
Yeah, so I think I need to clarify something. The question is not async versus imperative. You see, the classic models under which every one of us has been trained is C, C++, Java. I mean, it's an imperative model, sequential model. So if that is your basis, then async is a progress, because in problems like what you are describing, you have to use that. What I was describing in my conversation, if you may call it, with Joe Armstrong was that he said async and concurrent, pure concurrent, real concurrency are kind of dual. And if you have a system with lightweight, real, robust, fault-tolerant concurrency like Erlang, then async as in Node and Twisted and so on are not necessarily, not necessary, and they are a headache for the programmer, which Erlang, I think Go is similar, takes care of 80% of your headaches. So to come back to your problem, Google's data is running concurrently from your CLI. If you could model these two as two concurrent processes in a suitable system, then your work is done and you would be working with a suitable messaging format rather than trying to build the async callback and all that style of doing things. So it's not imperative versus async. It is async versus concurrency, pure real concurrency.
Okay, thank you. I also, there is, this is not my question. Actually, I do not want to ask question, but you were telling about Lisp thing. So I just started using Emacs, and there is, I just need to write some custom configuration for Emacs. So eLisp style, I just really felt in love with that. And I come to know a course, the MIT had this SICP. I really recommend this to the newcomers who love to see how this actually works. So it's very nice. Thanks.
I just mentioned my latest blog post is on SIPP.
Thank you. That's a very good contribution. It will help all us programmers quite a bit. A question again?
Hi. So, do you think that functional programming is the future, or do you think it will just remain for the elite programmers?
Oh, I think that question used to be asked, and I used to get upset 15 years back, but now, you see, in the old days, one would answer the question by saying, look, MongoDB has been, or is it CouchDB has been developed in Erlang, and such and Xmonad has been developed in Haskell, and so on. So we people, whoever, who were defendants of functional programming would show some one application out of 1,000 which had been done in a functional language and make a big thing about it. Today there is a different trend which I want to mention. This set-like expression which you see here, it has now gone into Python. Lambda expressions are now into C++. So functional programming is invading the mainstream. I don't expect that 10 years from now Haskell will become what Java is today. But I definitely can say that the language which will be mainstream 10 years from now will have as much from FP as it is from OOP. In fact, I am fairly certain that OOP's time is over. Okay, when I was a student in 89 or 88, everyone programmed in COBOL and Fortran, but we knew that, you know, this is on its way out technology. So my own personal take, I cannot justify it very easily in a short span, but I think OOP is on its way out.
I got my question pretty much answered here actually. My question was, what do you see the future of languages, considering the debate and everything that we are having with async and functional things? From business perspective, if I am planning a product 10 years down the lane, 20 years down the lane, what should I be thinking today? You know, from development, from a developer's perspective.
People are more close to the business side can take that.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it that way, one of the biggest problems we have is all these discussions we have, like, you know, which technology and all that. Finally, when you look at it, how many developers do we have in that technology? Question mark. You know, that's kind of a big debate that, you know, businesses have to go through, and many times maybe we use a suboptimal technology to develop something, but you know, that's how life is. You know.
The way I answer that is, you know, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you know Java, you use Java to solve all the problems that you can.
Yeah.
Your first question was entirely a business. Huh. So now, if you are asking from an academic point of view, I would ask you to ask the question again. So, are you a student, or are you in your first job, or I mean, it changes very much.
I'm an entrepreneur. I run a small development company actually.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to, you know, get into products which will be useful 10 years down the lane.
So what Ajay said may be partly said in joke, but it is very true that let us, I mean, just work out simple equations. Let us assume that we have data that Haskell programmers are 5 times more efficient than, that means they deliver 5 times more than Java programmers. Let's assume, right, because that's not the argument. And let's assume that a Haskell programmer costs 10 times a Java programmer. So what's your cost equations you have to work out, right? Yeah. Now, it's not so straightforward because there's the fixed cost, variable cost question. What is going to be your what is it called, turnover, how much will they leave, and so on. These are all questions which will change from place to place, from time to time, from paradigm and language to others, you know.
Yeah.
But these are the things which you need to think about.
Yeah, thanks, Rosie. I think we'll shift to the phone, folks on the phone. There seems to be a question on the phone. Yeah, please go ahead with your question.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm speaking from Nagpur. I'm a final year student over here in computer science. And my question to you is that for a student like me who is yet to take a first step towards OOP or something, some paradigm like that, what scope does the functional language have? And I would like you to answer this in the relevance of expert systems. I have a keen interest in artificial intelligence. So I've heard that functional languages functional paradigm is a better approach towards expert systems than the imperative one.
Lucy, you have anything?
Okay, I don't have a very specific answer, but you cannot ignore functional and declarative languages if you're in AI.
Yeah, actually, Lisp has been a
remotely like expert system you can't ignore, I think is a fair answer.
Yeah, so maybe if I want to summarize that answer for the sake of the student there, looking at Lisp and these kind of languages helps AI and expert systems quite a bit. But there are also examples of expert systems built in like C++, but you cannot ignore functional languages. That's the point. Anything else on the phone?
I would like to ask you if I want to learn one language in functional paradigm, what would the choice be for a beginner? I have this one quote I've heard, it is quite famous, that give a person to program in Lisp when he'll end up programming in C back again. Because we don't understand the paradigm well. Because what I'm planning to learn more and focus more is on the paradigm rather than the language. So what language do you suggest a beginner like me should learn in which that would clear my concepts on the paradigm rather than clearing it on the syntactical part?
Supposing somebody came to me and asked me, what is the best bike to buy? Or best car to buy or some such thing, and there was no further data about anything. I mean, what was your budget, what color you liked? I don't know what I can say. But I mean, I can make some comments. I don't know if I can recommend a language. In the space of functional programming, there is a lot of contention. So for example, people who sit outside will say Lisp is a functional language, ML is a functional language, and so on. But if you ask a Haskell programmer, he'll say, look, functional means what we call pure functional. Any language with an assignment statement is not functional. So Lisp is as imperative as Python, as C, as C++. The only real functional languages are the pure lazy languages, and there's really a few. Haskell is the most famous, but there are few such. Okay. So now there are these kind of contentious things. So now in a slightly different modification of that, for example, you have Scala and Clojure. Okay. Now, if much of your ecosystem is JVM based, then really there's very little to beat Scala. Okay. Likewise, if you have got a background from Lisp, then Clojure is really the modern Lisp. So, I mean, I really need to know more data about what you are looking for to be able to answer such a question.
If my background is C programming language and imperative paradigm.
Yeah.
Well, I can say that the biggest mind share currently seems to be with Haskell. But Haskell is also probably the hardest language to learn. Okay, so I mean, it's quite possible to pick up something like Python and use it in a very functional way. which you, for example, can't do with C. Okay, you can think in Python functionally, but in C you'll have to change your code to fit it into that. But in Python, you can actually write functional code in Python. The problem with that is that all the Python literature you will find will typically promote the OOP style over the functional style. So you will actually not find the material you need. So, you know, the questions are probably less technical and more social. Which kind of community calls you? Which style of discourse calls you? You know, those kind of questions. I mean, I can blow my own trumpet and say I had implemented a subset of Haskell. I mean, it's probably 1/100th of the size of Haskell, but it also takes about 1/100th of the time to learn. And I mean, for example, compiling Haskell takes about 3 hours, and compiling that system which I had made in the 90s takes about 10 seconds. So you get a sense of the scale. And that will cover in the intellectual sense about 80% of the difficult ideas in Haskell. So you may want to look at Hugs or Gopher. Okay.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. That almost answered my question. I had one more thing to ask before ending the conversation. That would be that I'm a newbie to OOP and I'm a newbie to functional also. So should I concentrate more on functional? Will it help me survive in the industry?
So I just want to add something here, you know. So one is you can be asking the question from point of view of, okay, you know, what will get me a job next, or what will help me to get admission for a PhD program next, or what are the concepts that I really want to learn and I should be learning, which will stand me over a long period of time. Okay, so please think. I would suggest that you think from the last point of view and learn all the concepts that are there. Each concept has its own value, its own new thing that it adds. So it's not this versus that, it's this and that and that. So you know, please think of that.
I think that's very well put, Arun.
I'll add a little to that. You see, concepts are ultimately perhaps the most important thing. But the concepts in our field, they get realized in implementation. So if you know how to write functions, you know how to write a loop, you know all that stuff, but you don't know what the command line for your compiler or interpreter is, you are in a certain sense stuck, okay? So sometimes you have to think very low-grade technical questions of how to use the system which is accessible to you. Sometimes you have to think concept questions. And sometimes you have to think a little more abstract paradigm questions of how do I organize my concepts differently than what I am used to and things like that. So it's good to think at all these three levels: technology, computer science, and paradigm, perspective, philosophy, whatever you want to call it. Try and devote yourself 1/3 to all three. This is my main advice to all students. You can't do without technology, but technology is not the only thing. Computer science is at least half of technology, but it's also not the only thing. So paradigm, computer science, technology, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3.
Very well put, Rusi. I think that's very succinct. Actually, that brings us to, I was just looking at the clock, it's kind of close to 5. It kind of brings us to one point that Arun and I were discussing earlier. This was about, okay, we have seen so much in programming languages all these days. What do we think will be the future now? No, that's the last part I was thinking about. And Arun, one of the things that I wanted to ask Arun is that all the languages that we talk about, programming languages, have their basis in some natural language, like mostly English, right? So, Arun, if you can, what are your thoughts on, would there be any programming languages in the future which do not need you to know English, or for that matter, some natural language?
Yeah, in fact, that's a question that was posed to us by Mr. Kohli, you know, who's, I mean, so people like him and a lot of others, you know, they are not thinking like programmers. They're thinking more at a national level. And kind of question is that, you know, you guys, you all studied engineering and studied in English, but then most of the country, you know, people don't really need to, I mean, do they need to understand English before they can learn programming? I mean, that's a kind of question. And is that something that comes in the way? So can you think of languages or ways of programming which do not tie you, which just don't make your thought process into another natural language? And that's a kind of question that is put to us. And I just thought, again, I don't know, for some reason, Scratch is coming back to everything. So one of the very nice things about it is that, we were able to teach Scratch to a Marathi medium school, and they picked it up very quickly.
So they didn't need to all the palettes that are there. They didn't need to understand.
No, I mean they could understand very easily. Okay, all we did was replace many of the literals from English into Marathi, which was a very sort of straightforward, phrase-to-phrase translation, and they could get on with it. But the interesting thing was they were also willing to pick up a lot of new words. And when the words are new, it doesn't matter which language they come from, they are words, right? So, for example, we might use the word okay even when you're speaking Marathi, and that doesn't seem to be a problem. So there are many of these new terms which people are able to pick up, but essentially it's getting away, making syntax sort of, okay, I won't say it's unimportant. The syntax is unimportant, but finding ways to deal with syntax much more easily. I mean, that's one.
So basically, what you're saying is that you can teach the concept of a loop, and for example, decision making without really telling them that loop is an English word, and can teach it in let's say another language.
Yeah, or you make them exercise loops, and then when you say it's loop, then it's easy.
Okay, interesting. So Rusi, I had one more futuristic question for you as well. So one of lots of developers today have all this pain. Biggest thing is, how do I prove my program to be correct, right? So that's a basic thing. Second thing is, how do I do all this organization of large libraries and things like that? Large libraries, so to speak. It's becoming more and more unmanageable in terms of thing. So let's address that one question. Correctness of programs. Do you have any suggestions for young programmers here of how to go about proving yourself whether your program is correct or not?
I mean, I didn't want to drive this functional programming bit too much, but functional programming history comes from the fact that they are the most straightforwardly provable programs.
Okay.
So functional programs will give you almost proofs for free. The other question is much harder. I can tell you, in the Haskell world, the Haskell libraries are a royal mess, because people are too much thinking of this kind of mathematical correctness, but system-wide correctness is somebody else's problem. So it doesn't get thought of. I don't think it's intrinsically that this style of thinking is suitable or not for that, but it's just that the people are so focused on mathematical side of things that system side of things is somebody else's problem.
Yeah, so we imperative people, so to speak, the imperative people are stuck with non-provable programs,
yes,
so to speak.
See, there are...
Can I? Okay, after you finish. Yeah, please. No, I just want to add to that, yeah. So, good news for the imperative sort of people, okay? So there is a lot of work that has been going on in this area. Okay. Now, using theory proving techniques. Okay, so you can take a C program, you can put a lot of assertions in the program, and then you can actually prove that, or have a tool actually, which will say that yes, that assertion will hold or not hold. If it won't hold, then under what things. So essentially, you can describe program properties and have have tools that do analysis using those. So to some extent, okay, again, there are a lot of scalability issues there, but the scalability issues are being solved. So, so people can prove larger and larger programs today. So this general, whatever proving, or let's call it a verification problem, right, has been tackled at several different levels. So for example, one is you can analyze a C program and say that, it looks to me like you have a problem here because you can end up with a divide by zero here or a null dereference here, okay? So a lot of these tools have come into place and they scale quite well for large programs, and they can also give guarantees. So there are two classes of tools. One are tools that will find such faults and be very, very precise about it. That if they say it's a fault, it's very likely it's a fault. But they might miss out a lot of other faults. So they cannot guarantee that your program is free of other faults. But at the same time, there are other tools which will, to some degree of precision, okay, tell you that yes, you have a fault here, or you may have a fault here, and maybe 90% of the time or 80% of the time, you will likely to have a fault there. So there are many such tools which are out there, and so I'm happy to say that part of our research is in that area. And so that's one thing. And then sort of formal specification techniques are being used quite a bit. State charts are being used quite a bit, where now you can kind of work at the design level, where you can say that you can prove sort of have analyzers prove whether a certain property will hold or not. So, and again, in all of these issues, this kind of science is done in the sense that theoretically we have methods to do that, but the scalability is the big issue. And most of the research work is focused around solving the scalability issues. So the good news is that a lot of these problems are being addressed, the tools are coming there, and you can use the tools without understanding the science behind it. So
Which is good.
Okay. Let me add one thing. So next month's Turing talk, so this is the fourth Saturday of September 28th. Right? September 28th, we are going to talk about some concepts around how to write, how to do program verification and proofs and around that.
Okay. Yeah, there is a question there. Yeah, let's go with it.
Ajay sir just asked that how we can prove that our program is correct or not. So I think there is one thing, test-driven development, which is very popular amongst new technologies. Or in C also we can write unit tests to actually prove our program's correctness on different implementations of the language or on different platforms also. And after 100 years, we can also state at this point that after 100 years also, it will this program will give same result as of now. So writing tests as I am a programmer, I write my program. I am writing my program, so I will be knowing that how it will be giving result in some situations. So I will write tests in that sense. So
okay, yeah, thanks. Good. One last question there.
So I just want to say something here. You can't use the word test and prove in the same sentence. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, the famous state.
just a small question.
No, there is only one question, please. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Well, my question is to Arun. There were two comments which you made at different points, which I kind of added up. One was about decomposing a problem into smaller parts, and the other was what I saw as the general philosophy of TCS, TRDDC, which is a tool philosophy where you think of problems in terms of little languages and think of how do you write tools to refine those languages into something. And one point which has not come up in this panel discussion, which I think is very fundamental to programmer productivity, which is that there are two languages in question when a program is being written to solve a problem. One is a thinking language of the programmer, and the other is the programming language. And I think programmer productivity drops drastically because these two languages often get mixed up. So my question to you is that this tool philosophy that you have, that we think of little languages and write little tools to refine them to Java or C++ or whatever, once the problem domain has been, so to say, modeled as a language, can this not be taken one step further for programmers thinking? That you systematically, in a very systematic manner, mechanize the transformation of what a programmer is thinking with some rules into some real programming language, rather than, this is a n cross m problem, all his thoughts and all the possible languages. So what do you have to say about this, to reduce it to an m plus n problem?
Yeah, no, so, okay, it is, yeah, that's right. So that is really the attempt, because the whole tools philosophy says that I want to break, or one of the standard mechanisms that I want to specify what does somebody want, okay, and the second part is how do I implement that what. So you try to break that into two parts, and you hope that the language in which you express what is it that you want is closer to what a programmer or a developer, whatever you want to call them, can relate to. And the second part is which can be more complex, saying that how do I implement that well. So these are two very different things that are there.
I mean is that to all our young programmers and students who are asking questions of what programming language should I learn, should they not concentrate more on a thinking language which will outlive all the changes in technology and programming language?
No, so that's why this thinking is that's what it's a very broad, right? I mean, which applies at multiple layers. Like, think about what you want and think about how you will implement what you want. I mean, that's the broad philosophy which is out there. But there are many different ways in which you think about what you want and many different ways in which you implement. So those are things that you have to keep learning, right?
Thanks, Arun. I think this can go on for a long time, but I think we'll end it at this. Let's give our panel, Rustam Modi and Arun Bhavulkar, a big hand. It was a great, thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks, folks. And you have a good evening.
Yeah, please stay.
Yeah, so I'd just like to express thanks to Ajay for really stimulating a very interesting discussion. At least I definitely enjoyed this.
Thanks, Ajay, and thanks all of you for participating.
So before we disperse, just one quick, want to just a small token of appreciation to both Rustam and Arun. We really had a great time. And with that, we come to the end of today's event. The next Tech Talk will be on September 28th, and it will cover the work of Professor Anir Newley. And the speakers are Dr. Basant Rajan, who's the CEO of Coriolis, and R. Venkatesh from TRDDC. They'll cover the concepts of program verification and things like that, which we kind of ended this panel with. So that'll be a good segue into that next session as well. So look forward to seeing you there. Thank you for being a wonderful audience. Bye-bye.